Blake Worthington III stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, his eyes unseeing as they gazed upon the glittering Los Angeles skyline. At 27, he should have been in the prime of his life. Instead, he felt like a prisoner in his own body, trapped in a wheelchair that seemed to mock his very existence. The sound of the apartment door opening barely registered. Blake knew it would be his father, Robert, coming to check on him as he did every day, as if he were some invalid who needed constant supervision. "Blake?" Robert's voice carried across the spacious living room. "Son, it's a beautiful day outside. Why don't you go out for a bit, get some fresh air?" Blake's jaw clenched. He didn't bother to turn around as he replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, sure, Dad. Let me just hop up and go for a jog, shall I?" He heard his father's weary sigh, could practically feel the man's frustration radiating across the room. "That's not what I meant, and you know it. The garden is lovely this time of year. I could what?" Blake interrupted, finally spinning his wheelchair to face his father. "Wheel around like some pathetic charity case for all the neighbors to gawk at? No thanks." Robert's face fell, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Blake, please, this isn't healthy. You can't just..." "I can't just what, Dad?" Blake's voice rose, anger bubbling to the surface. "Can't just walk? Can't just be normal?" "Yeah, I think we've established that pretty clearly." For a moment, father and son stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken words and simmering resentment. Finally, Robert shook his head. "I'll come back later. Try to eat something, okay?" As the door closed behind his father, Blake let out a frustrated growl, slamming his fist against the armrest of his wheelchair. The pain that shot through his hand was a welcome distraction from the constant ache in his useless legs. He wheeled himself back to the window, his reflection a ghostly overlay on the city beyond. Blake barely recognized the man staring back at him. Gone was the cocky grin, the perfectly styled hair, the designer clothes that had once been his armor. Now, all he saw was a broken shell of his former self, dressed in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, his hair a disheveled mess. As he sat there, memories of that fateful night flooded his mind, the night that had changed everything, the night he'd learned, in the harshest way possible, that actions have consequences. 6 months earlier, the Crimson Lounge was the hottest spot in LA, and Blake Worthington III was holding court. Surrounded by a group of equally wealthy and equally drunk friends, he sprawled in a VIP booth, his designer suit perfectly tailored to his athletic frame. Another round, he called out, waving a black Amex card at a passing waitress. The girl, clearly new and overwhelmed by the frenetic energy of the club, nodded quickly and scurried off. "Easy there, Tiger," laughed Chad, one of Blake's longtime drinking buddies. "You trying to drink the place dry?" Blake grinned, the alcohol making him feel invincible. "Why not? Daddy Dearest is footing the bill anyway. Might as well make it worth his while." As the group erupted in laughter, Blake's eyes landed on a figure moving through the crowd. A new waitress, one he hadn't seen before. She was petite, with long chestnut hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Unlike the other waitresses in their skimpy outfits, this one wore a crisp white shirt and black slacks. But it was her face that caught Blake's attention. A quiet beauty, with large, expressive eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Well, well," Blake murmured, sitting up straighter. "What do we have here?" Chad followed his gaze and whistled low. "Fresh meat, bro. Want me to call her over?" Blake shook his head, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Nah, I got this." He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly as the room spun around him. Ignoring his friend's drunken catcalls, Blake made his way across the club, his eyes locked on his target. The girl was at the bar, waiting for an order to be filled. Blake sidled up next to her, leaning against the bar, in what he imagined was a suave pose. "Hey there, beautiful," he slurred, flashing what he thought was his most charming smile. "What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?" The waitress glanced at him, her expression neutral. "Working, sir?" "Can I help you with something?" Blake chuckled, moving closer. "Oh, I can think of a few ways you could help me." "What time do you get off? I've got a suite at the Ritz with our name on it." The girl's eyes widened, a flash of disgust crossing her face. "I'm not interested. Please leave me alone." But Blake, too drunk and too used to getting his way, wasn't about to take no for an answer. He reached out, grabbing her arm. "Come on, don't be like that. I'll make it worth your while. How much do you make in a night? I'll double it, triple it." "Let go of me," the girl said, her voice low but firm. When Blake's grip only tightened, she did the only thing she could think of. She slapped him hard across the face. The sound seemed to echo through the club. Blake stumbled back, more from shock than from the force of the blow. For a moment, he just stared at her, disbelief written across his features. Then, as the reality of what had happened sank in, his face contorted with rage. "You bitch," he roared, lunging forward. What happened next was a blur of chaos and destruction. Blake, blind with fury and alcohol, began tearing through the club. He upended tables, smashed glasses, screamed obscenities at anyone who tried to stop him. Security guards rushed in, but in his adrenaline-fueled state, Blake fought them off, sending bodies flying. In the midst of the mayhem, no one noticed the large decorative mirror on the wall coming loose from its moorings. No one, that is, except the young waitress, whose eyes widened in horror as she saw it begin to fall. "Look out," she screamed, but it was too late. The mirror came crashing down, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. And there, in the center of it all, stood Blake, a look of confusion replacing the anger on his face as he felt a sharp, burning pain in his back. As he crumpled to the ground, the last thing Blake saw before darkness claimed him was the face of the waitress. Her eyes filled not with satisfaction or vindication, but with genuine concern and fear. Then there was nothing but blackness. Blake's eyes snapped open, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. For a moment he was back there, lying on the club floor, surrounded by broken glass and stunned onlookers. But as his vision cleared, he found himself back in his bedroom, the memory fading like a bad dream. Except it wasn't a dream. It was his reality now. With a groan, Blake pushed himself up, his arms straining as he maneuvered himself from his bed to the wheelchair beside it. Every morning, the same routine. Every morning, the same crushing realization that this was his life now. As he wheeled himself to the bathroom, Blake caught sight of himself in the mirror and quickly looked away. He couldn't stand to see what he'd become, a shadow of his former self, weak and dependent. The doctors had told him there was hope, that with time and intensive physical therapy, he might regain some function in his legs. But Blake had given up on hope a long time ago. What was the point? He'd never be the man he was before. Never be able to do the things he loved, never be looked at the same way again. Gritting his teeth, Blake decided to prove to himself and to his hovering father that he wasn't completely useless. He'd stand up, just for a moment, just to show that he could. Gripping the edges of his wheelchair, Blake took a deep breath and pushed. For a second, he was vertical, a rush of triumph flooding through him. Then, just as quickly, his legs buckled beneath him. Blake crashed to the floor, pain shooting through his body as he landed awkwardly. But it was nothing compared to the pain in his chest, the crushing weight of failure and despair. "Fuck," he screamed, slamming his fist against the hardwood floor. Again and again he pounded, until his knuckles were bloody and raw. As the rage subsided, it was replaced by something worse, a deep, consuming hopelessness. Lying there on the cold floor, Blake felt tears begin to roll down his cheeks. He cried for the life he'd lost, for the man he used to be, for the future that had been stolen from him in one moment of drunken stupidity. But mostly, he cried because he was alone, truly, utterly alone. His so-called friends had disappeared the moment he was no longer the life of the party. The endless stream of beautiful women had dried up when he could no longer wine and dine them in style. Even his own father looked at him with pity rather than pride. As the tears subsided, a dangerous thought began to take root in Blake's mind. What was the point of going on like this? Why continue to be a burden on everyone around him? Maybe it would be better for everyone if he just ended it all. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it brought a strange sense of calm. For the first time in months, Blake felt like he had control over something in his life. He could choose to end his suffering. He could free his father from the obligation of caring for him. He could just disappear. With newfound determination, Blake pulled himself back into his wheelchair. He knew what he had to do. One last ride, one last view of the world, and then peace. As he wheeled himself out of his room, Blake felt lighter than he had in months. Soon it would all be over. Soon he would be free. The sun was just beginning to dip towards the horizon as Blake made his way along the path that led to the cliffs overlooking the Pacific. It was a route he knew well. In what felt like another lifetime, he'd often come here for morning runs or to clear his head after a long night of partying. Now, he was here for a very different reason. As he approached the cliff's edge, Blake felt a sense of calm wash over him. The constant ache in his useless legs, the gnawing emptiness in his chest. Soon it would all be over. He'd made his peace with his decision. No note, no final phone calls, just a quiet exit from a world that no longer had a place for him. Blake was so lost in his thoughts that he almost missed it. A flash of movement in the tall grass off to the side of the path. He blinked, focusing on the spot. There, half hidden by the swaying stalks, was a dog. A large one, some kind of shepherd mix by the looks of it. Under normal circumstances, Blake would have kept going. He'd never been much of an animal person, but something about the dog's posture caught his attention. It wasn't relaxed or playful. It was alert, almost protective, as if it were guarding something. Curiosity got the better of him. Blake hesitated, glancing between the dog and the cliff's edge. What did it matter now? He had all the time in the world, didn't he? Slowly, cautiously, he began to wheel himself towards the dog. As he got closer, the animal's ears flattened and a low growl rumbled in its throat. "Easy there, boy," Blake said softly, holding up his hands. "I'm not gonna hurt you. What have you got there, huh?" The dog's growl intensified as Blake drew nearer, but it didn't move from its spot. And then, as he peered around the animal's protective stance, Blake's heart nearly stopped. There, lying motionless in the grass, was a young woman. Holy shit, Blake breathed, his suicide plans momentarily forgotten. He leaned forward in his chair, straining to get a better look. The woman was face down, her long dark hair fanned out around her. She wasn't moving. For a moment, Blake was paralyzed with indecision. Should he call for help? Try to wake her? What if she was? No, he couldn't think like that. He had to do something. Taking a deep breath, Blake began to ease himself out of his wheelchair. The dog's growls grew louder, but Blake ignored it, focused entirely on reaching the unconscious woman. It took every ounce of strength he had, but Blake managed to drag himself across the ground to the woman's side. Gently, he rolled her over, brushing the hair from her face. And then, for the second time in as many minutes, Blake felt the world tilt on its axis. He knew this face. It was older, more mature than he remembered, but unmistakable. It was her, the waitress from the club, the one he'd harassed, the one who'd slapped him, the one who'd been there the night everything changed. Hazel, Blake whispered, the name coming back to him in a rush. What were the odds? Of all the people in the world, how had he stumbled upon her here, like this? There was no time to ponder the strange twists of fate. Blake could see the shallow rise and fall of Hazel's chest. She was alive, but clearly in distress. He had to get her help. With a grunt of effort, Blake began the arduous process of lifting Hazel into his wheelchair. It was awkward and difficult, and more than once he nearly toppled them both to the ground. But finally, miraculously, he managed to settle her across his lap. As he began to wheel them both back towards his house, the dog fell into step beside them. Its earlier aggression replaced by obvious concern for its owner. Blake's arms burned with the effort of pushing the chair with the added weight, but he hardly noticed. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about his own problems. For the first time in months, he had a purpose. As they made their way up the path, Blake found himself whispering words of encouragement to Hazel, to the dog, to himself. He wasn't sure. "Hang on," he murmured. "Just hang on. We're almost there. You're gonna be okay." And as the words left his mouth, Blake realized with a start that he wasn't just talking about Hazel anymore. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for him too. Robert Worthington had seen a lot in his 60-plus years on this earth. He'd built an empire from nothing, weathered economic storms that had sunk lesser men, and raised a son as a single father after his wife's untimely passing. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him as he pulled into the driveway of his expansive Malibu estate. There, struggling up the long drive, was his son Blake, the same son who hadn't left the house in months, who could barely be bothered to get out of bed most days. and across his lap, clearly unconscious, was a young woman Robert had never seen before. Trotting alongside them was a large, anxious-looking dog. For a moment, Robert simply stared, wondering if perhaps he'd finally cracked under the stress of the past few months. Then his instincts kicked in, and he was out of the car in a flash. "Blake," he called, jogging towards his son. "What in God's name is going on? Who is this? What happened?" Blake looked up, his face streaked with sweat from the exertion of pushing his wheelchair with the added weight. "Dad," he panted. "Thank God. We need to call an ambulance. I found her by the cliffs. I think she's sick or something." Robert didn't waste time with more questions. He pulled out his phone, quickly dialing 911 as he approached the strange trio. "Yes, hello? We need an ambulance at 1420 Pacific Coast Highway," he said crisply into the phone. Young woman, unconscious, unsure of the cause. As Robert rattled off details to the dispatcher, he couldn't help but marvel at the change in his son. For months, Blake had been his former self, bitter and withdrawn. But now, as he hovered anxiously over the unconscious young woman, Robert saw a spark of the old Blake, the one who, beneath all the bravado and recklessness, had a good heart. "Son," Robert said as he hung up the phone, "let's get her inside while we wait for the ambulance." "Can you manage, or should I? I've got her," Blake interrupted, a note of fierce determination in his voice. Just get the door, okay?" Robert nodded, hurrying ahead to hold open the large oak doors of their mansion. As Blake wheeled past him, the unconscious woman cradled awkwardly but gently in his lap. Robert felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. Whatever had happened out there by the cliffs, it was clear that something had changed for Blake. The next hour passed in a blur of sirens, paramedics, and questions. As the young woman, whom Blake identified as Hazel, was loaded into the ambulance, Robert noticed his son's reluctance to let her go. "We should follow them to the hospital," Blake said, his eyes never leaving the ambulance as it pulled away. "Make sure she's okay." Robert placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Blake, son, I think maybe you should tell me what's really going on here. Do you know this girl?" Blake's shoulders slumped, and for a moment Robert thought he might shut down again. But then Blake looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of shame and resolve. "Yeah, Dad, I know her. She's the waitress from the club, the night of the accident." Robert's eyebrows shot up in surprise. The one I harassed," Blake finished, his voice heavy with regret. "The one who slapped me, the one who tried to warn me about the mirror." Father and son shared a long look, years of unspoken emotions passing between them. Finally, Robert nodded. "All right, let's get you cleaned up, and then we'll head to the hospital. I think you've got a story to tell me on the way." As they drove through the LA traffic towards Cedars-Sinai, Blake recounted the events of the afternoon. His dark thoughts, his trip to the cliffs, and the unexpected discovery that had changed everything. Robert listened silently, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he realized just how close he'd come to losing his son. "I don't know, Dad," Blake finished, staring out the window. "It's like, finding her like that, it made me realize how stupid I've been, how selfish. I mean, what right do I have to give up when I'm still breathing, still have a chance? And then to find out it was her, of all people." Robert cleared his throat, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Sometimes, son, the universe has a way of giving us second chances. Sounds to me like you've been handed one. Question is, what are you going to do with it?" Blake turned to his father, a look of determination on his face that Robert hadn't seen in months. "I'm going to make it count, Dad, I swear." As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Robert smiled. For the first time since that terrible night 6 months ago, he felt a glimmer of hope for his son's future. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Blake, much to his father's surprise and delight, threw himself into following up on Hazel's condition with an energy he hadn't displayed in months. They learned that Hazel had collapsed due to a combination of extreme fatigue, dehydration, and sun exposure. She'd been studying for her final exams, barely sleeping or eating, and had gone for a walk to clear her head when she'd passed out. "She's going to be fine," the doctor assured them. "She just needs rest and proper nutrition. It's lucky your son found her when he did. Much longer in that sun, and things could have been much worse." Blake, who had insisted on being present for every update, let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "When can she have visitors?" he asked eagerly. The doctor smiled kindly. "She's still sleeping now, but probably tomorrow. I'll let you know." As they left the hospital that evening, Robert couldn't help but notice the change in his son. Blake seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "You know," Robert said carefully as they drove home, "Hazel's going to be all right. You don't have to keep coming back to the hospital every day." Blake was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "I know, Dad, but I want to. I need to." Robert nodded, understanding. This wasn't just about Hazel's health anymore. This was about Blake's redemption, both in Hazel's eyes and in his own. The next morning, Blake was up early, something that hadn't happened since before the accident. He wheeled himself into the kitchen where Robert was nursing a cup of coffee, reading the morning paper. "Dad," Blake said, his voice tentative, "I've been thinking about rehab, the doctors you wanted me to see. I think I'm ready to give it a real shot." Robert nearly choked on his coffee. He set down his mug, turning to face his son fully. "You're sure? Because Blake, if we do this, you have to be all in. No more half-hearted attempts, no more giving up when it gets tough." Blake nodded solemnly. "I'm sure, Dad. I want to walk again. I want to be better. For myself, for you, and, well, for Hazel too, I guess." Robert felt a lump form in his throat. Blinking back tears, he reached out and squeezed his son's shoulder. "All right, then. We'll make some calls today. Together." As they sat there, father and son, making plans for the future, neither could have predicted the journey that lay ahead. A journey of hard work, setbacks, triumphs, and ultimately, redemption. 2 days later, Blake found himself outside Hazel's hospital room, his heart pounding. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say 1,000 times, but now that the moment was here, all his carefully prepared words seemed to evaporate. Taking a deep breath, he knocked softly on the door. "Come in," called a voice from inside. Her voice. Blake pushed the door open, wheeling himself into the room. And there she was, Hazel, sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert. Her eyes widened as she recognized him, a mix of emotions flashing across her face. "You," she said softly, "you're the one who found me." Blake nodded, wheeling closer to her bed. "Yeah, that's right, I'm Blake. Blake Worthington. And you're Hazel. We've met before, actually." Hazel's brow furrowed for a moment, then cleared as recognition dawned. "The club," she said. "You were the guy who acted like a complete jackass?" Blake finished, a rueful smile on his face. "Yeah, that was me. Hazel, I owe you an apology. Several, actually." And so sitting there in that sterile hospital room, Blake poured out his heart. He apologized for his behavior at the club, for the trouble he'd caused her. He told her about the accident, about his struggles since then. And finally, he thanked her for slapping some sense into him that night, for inadvertently saving his life when she tried to warn him about the falling mirror, and for giving him a reason to keep going when he'd found her by the cliffs. Hazel listened silently, her expression unreadable. When Blake finally fell quiet, she was quiet for a long moment. "Wow," she said at last, That's a lot to process." Blake nodded, suddenly feeling very small. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me or anything. I needed you to know how sorry I am for everything." To his surprise, Hazel reached out and placed her hand on his. "Blake," she said softly, "thank you for the apology, for saving me, for being honest. I can see how much you've changed." Blake felt a warmth spread through him at her touch, at her words. So he said, trying to lighten the mood, "Friends?" Hazel smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "Let's start with acquaintances and see where it goes, okay?" As they sat there, talking and laughing, neither noticed Robert watching from the doorway, a satisfied smile on his face. His son was back, changed, humbled, but back nonetheless. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in months, Robert believed that everything was going to be all right. 6 months later, the sun was just beginning to set over the Pacific as Hazel made her way down the familiar path to the cliffs. Her dog Max trotted happily beside her, his tail wagging as he enjoyed the evening air. So much had changed since that fateful day when she'd collapsed here. She'd graduated college, started a new job, and made a friend she never would have expected, Blake Worthington. True to his word, Blake had thrown himself into his rehabilitation with a determination that amazed everyone around him. There had been setbacks and frustrations, moments when he'd wanted to give up, but every time, he'd picked himself up and kept going. Hazel had been there through it all, offering encouragement and support. What had started as a tentative acquaintanceship had blossomed into a deep friendship. She'd seen the real Blake emerge, kind, funny, surprisingly thoughtful, so different from the arrogant playboy she'd first encountered. As she reached their usual spot, Hazel settled onto the grass, absently scratching Max behind the ears as she gazed out at the ocean. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a familiar voice spoke. "Room for one more?" Hazel turned, a smile spreading across her face as she saw Blake standing there. Standing, not sitting in his wheelchair. He was leaning on a cane, but he was on his own 2 feet. "Blake," she exclaimed, jumping up. "You're walking. When did this happen?" Blake grinned, clearly pleased with her reaction. "Just got the all clear from the doctors yesterday. Wanted to surprise you." Hazel felt tears prick at her eyes. She knew how hard Blake had worked for this moment, how much it meant to him. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. Blake's expression softened. He took a step closer to her, only a slight unsteadiness in his gait. "I couldn't have done it without you, Hazel. Your support, your friendship, it meant everything." There was a moment of charged silence between them, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, Blake took a deep breath. "Listen, Hazel, there's something I've been wanting to ask you now that I'm back on my feet, literally. I was wondering if you'd like to go on a date with me? A real date, not just hanging out as friends." Hazel felt her heart skip a beat. She'd be lying if she said she hadn't thought about it, hadn't felt the growing attraction between them. But she'd always held back, not wanting to complicate Blake's recovery. "Yes, Blake, I'd love to go on a date with you." The smile that lit up Blake's face was brighter than any she'd ever seen. Tentatively, he reached out and took her hand in his. As they stood there, hand in hand, with Max circling excitedly around their feet, Hazel couldn't help but marvel at the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter, a near tragedy, and now, the beginning of something beautiful. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold. But Blake and Hazel hardly noticed, too lost in each other's eyes. Too caught up in the promise of the future stretching out before them. It was a new chapter for both of them, and as they shared their first kiss, soft and sweet in the fading light, they both knew that it was going to be the best one yet.